just to introduce, for people who haven't been to, this is the third event of our series, for people who haven't been to the other two events, the theme of our autumn series has been to think about some of the dimensions of cultural and social inequality. Just the idea of trying to traverse the whole of cultural and social inequality is an absolutely enormous topic, so we've had to be a little bit selective about how we do it. So we began the series by looking at what most people think of first, which is economic inequality, and we had a couple of good speakers. We had Warwick Smith from Per Capita and I've forgotten his first name, Nicholas Hero from Melbourne University. And then for our second series, when we were talking about trying to, I suppose, collapse down the broad idea of cultural inequality into just a single element of it, we had Tony Moore and Janet McCalman talking about class and how class is understood in a more contemporary setting, I guess. And in this one, we're talking about the question of, can we fix inequality? Well, again, that's something that's a fairly large area to address. So I think one needs to be a little bit selective, I guess, about how to approach these kind of things. So we have two speakers tonight with sort of subtopics, I guess, in that particular area. Jim Stanford will be our first speaker, and he will address, can changing the rules in the labour market help to fix inequality? And then Professor Shelley Mallett, who's sitting down there, will speak on, can changing the rules on social welfare help to fix inequality? So I'll begin by introducing Jim Stanford. As I said, he's had to fly home to Canada, and that's why we've had to Skype him in. He's a prodigiously productive researcher on work and labour force issues for the Centre for Future Work, based at the Australia Institute, of which he was the inaugural director starting in 2016. If you visit the website of the Centre for Future Work, you'll find that close to once a month they produce a new report or insight into the Australian workforce conditions. And the latest offering of their latest report of theirs, which is very timely landing, I guess, in terms of penalty rates, but it's on penalty rates and employment 1 year later. And it was issued, I think, on about the 2nd of July. In Canada, Jim served for over 20 years as economist and director of policy with Unifor, Canada's largest private sector trade union, which was formerly the Canadian Auto Workers. He's an economist and the author of Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism, which has been published in 6 languages. Jim has also written, edited or co-edited 5 other books and dozens of articles and reports in both peer-reviewed and popular outlets. In Australia, Jim's pursued interests in precarious work and insecure work, the effects of automation on work, the strategic importance of public sector work, and how governments could support better wages and working conditions for everyone.
I'd like to walk through some of the economics behind why I think one of the most important solutions to inequality in Australia and the growth of inequality, which the Fabians, of course, have been following and organizing around very carefully. One of the most important solutions is to rebuild the power of trade unions and collective bargaining. And so I'll give my presentation on that, and then we'll later on, very glad to have any kind of Q&A that may be following up. And let me just make sure that you can see the slides. Can you see the slides now, folks? Excellent. Okay, thumbs up all around there. And guess what? Somehow you miraculously fixed the microphone, because I can hear you now. We were unable to hear each other during the test, so whatever you did, it worked. So I can hear you now as well as you hearing me, so you can shout out any instructions if need be. Okay, so here first of all is a little bit of coordinates for our Centre for Future Work, which is a research institute housed within the Australia Institute that looks at issues of work and employment and fairness in the workplace. There's our website. All of our research is available there. And there's my Twitter handle and the Centre's Twitter handle. You are very welcome to tweet out anything you'd like from this presentation today. Please join the conversation on social media. I am an economist, and I spent my entire career working with trade unions. So I'm a union economist, and that's kind of a funny term. Many in the Murdoch media would think that union economist is a contradiction in terms, kind of like military intelligence, perhaps, or clean coal, dare I say. Union economist, what are you talking about? Unions just mess up the economy, and they get in the way of supply and demand, and they interrupt the efficiency of the free market. Contrary to that, I think unions play a productive and essential economic role in the economy, and it's very much related to the need to combat inequality. In fact, unions were invented to fight inequality. The reality is, in the what is called the labor market, the place where workers look for work and get hired, and employers find the labor that they need, this is not a trade between equals. It's not like you have one person on one side of the table, the other person on the other side of the table, and they just get together and figure out what works well for both of them. The reality is there's a fundamental imbalance of power in the labor market that shapes all of the contracts and all of the agreements that are reached in the course of determining wages and conditions in employment. Employers naturally have the upper hand in any kind of negotiations over wages and conditions. They're the ones who do the hiring and firing, so they have the power to decide whether someone works or not. And employers do need workers to do the job. That's where most of the value added in society comes from people exerting their brains and their brawn to produce goods and services. But they generally do not need any particular worker, any particular individual worker, unless you happen to have a totally unique, irreplaceable talent, someone like Steve Jobs, perhaps. You don't have any particular bargaining power with your employer as an individual because you can always be replaced by someone else. On the other hand, for each individual worker, they desperately need their employer. They need that job to support themselves and their family. And that creates a fundamental imbalance of bargaining power in the labor market, which is exactly what unions were created to address. So if you're approaching the employer one-on-one, the reality is you will never be able to get a fair share of the wealth that you produce through your work. And this reality was understood by workers very, very early in the history of capitalism. Very early in the Industrial Revolution, when wage labor was invented and workers started moving into the cities to work in large factories, they understood very quickly that they needed to get together to approach the employer with some kind of collective power in order to get the employer to pay attention to them. And the economics of that is this collective approach to employers is a way of fixing that fundamental asymmetry in bargaining power that is the reality of the labor market. We have to get to a situation where employers need workers in the collective sense as much as workers need employers. And that's when you have the opportunity to reach an agreement that is somehow fairer in terms of the distribution of wealth. And so right from the early days of the Industrial Revolution, workers have been approaching employers collectively, trying to form unions and syndicates and guilds to offset that imbalance in bargaining power. And initially, of course, business-friendly governments and police forces suppressed those efforts by workers to bargain collectively. Unions, of course, were outlawed. Trade unionists were jailed or worse in the early years. And it wasn't really until many decades later that unions finally won the legal right to exist. And the language of free markets was always invoked in order to justify these restrictions on unions. It was often argued that unions were a barrier to competition, somehow an imperfection in what would otherwise be a free and efficient market transaction. In fact, we still hear that language sometimes. Think about the former One Nations senator, Malcolm Roberts, I think his name is, from Queensland, who was arguing last year to basically strip unions of the legal right to exist in Australia because they were a barrier to competition. So that old argument has been there. Unions finally did win the right to organize and bargain collectively to various degrees in various countries, and we have to keep in mind the restrictions on union activity in Australia today are among the most severe of any industrial country. So that fight for the right to bargain collectively is still going on. But no sooner had unions won the first right to exist and bargain, say in the 1820s, that was one of the first strikes in London of the typographical workers. By the 1830s, employers were saying things like, oh, sure, maybe unions were necessary back in the 1820s, but this is the 1830s. This is the modern economy. We don't need unions anymore. And of course, they're still saying that today, arguing that unions are outdated. But in fact, I would argue unions are as essential or likely more essential than they were in the Industrial Revolution because of the fragmentation of workplaces. You don't have workers as often in large groups in single workplaces where you can have a kind of natural collective power or natural solidarity just by virtue of your workplace. Today, if anything, where people are dispersed or even working as individual gig workers, I would argue you need unions more than ever. So this is how to even the scales, and this approach to employers collectively ensures that the employer has to take the process of negotiations more seriously. So I think this is an important backdrop to thinking about inequality and where inequality comes from. We often talk about inequality as if it's a matter of just comparing individuals. Some individuals are rich, some individuals are poor, and that's wrong. And of course it is wrong. But we have to look at the structural forces or the systemic forces behind those gaps between individuals to understand the problem and also to identify the solution. And the reality is that fundamental inequality in bargaining power in the competitive labor market is a key factor in the unequal division of wealth within society. And even mainstream international institutions like recent research from the OECD and the IMF has now identified that the erosion of union power and collective bargaining has been one of the key factors in the rise in inequality in most of the advanced industrial countries over the last generation. In this regard, it's useful to think about two different ways of looking at inequality. We can measure inequality between households or between individuals, as I mentioned, in terms of their income or their wealth or their consumption opportunities, and there's lots of different ways of doing that, and that's important. But at the same time, there's an overlapping and related measure of inequality where we're looking at the distribution of income across factors of production. By this, I mean labor, capital, that is the wealth wrapped up in businesses, the economic footprint of small businesses and farms, and the other factors of production. We have to understand how income is being distributed across factors in order to understand how they're being distributed across individuals, because the two are related. Individuals get their income from a combination of the different factors of production that they have a stake in. So if you own capital, you get some income from capital. If you don't, then you get pretty well all of your income from your labor, perhaps supplemented by whatever income security payments you get from government. And the reality is, because wealth is owned by the wealthy, okay, there's a shocking statement to make, but the reality is wealth is incredibly unevenly distributed, and at least half of the wealth, the financial wealth in the country, is owned by the richest 10% of the population. That means any shift in distribution of income across factors towards the wealthy is going to show up in a dramatic increase in income inequality across individuals. So this graph shows the changing distribution of income between factors, in particular the shrinking share of GDP in Australia that's captured by workers in the form of compensation for their services. And compensation here includes wages, salaries, and superannuation contributions by their employers. And this is a graph that really shows in one picture that really tells the whole history of neoliberalism. They often say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, this is 1,000 words right here on the conditions that led up to neoliberalism and the big U-turn in economic policies that has been experienced in Australia and other advanced industrial countries, and then what's happened since. So you'll see that during the 1960s and the 70s and the 1950s before that, workers' share of the economic pie was growing steadily in the post-war era. And it wasn't an accident. It was because of deliberate efforts through policy, measures to distribute income more equally, the growth of unions and the activism of unions, and the strengthening of the awards system and other measures that were intended to distribute income more equally across society. This was the era of inclusive growth, and this is when workers' real living standards grew rapidly. But starting with the late 1970s, early 1980s, you had a significant and sustained decline in labor's share of the economic pie, and that also wasn't an accident. It reflected a range of policy measures, in Australia's case, implemented by different governments of different political stripes, but all of them basically contributing to an erosion of workers' bargaining power in the economy and a reinforcement of businesses' ability to unilaterally set the terms of the employment deal. So you've seen a significant decline in labor's share of the GDP over that whole period, over the last 40 years. And a year ago, in March 2017, it actually reached a low point, the lowest point in the entire post-war history of Australia. So this is a very sustained and systematic redistribution of wealth between the factors of production, from labor to capital. And most of that decline in labor's share of the GDP has been reflected in a rise in the share of corporate profits in GDP. Now, this is a way of measuring income distribution between individuals. And this picture also tells 1,000 words about the history of neoliberalism. You'll see that prior to World War II, the richest 1% of society was taking in roughly 10% or more of all total income. So in other words, they're getting more than 10 times their proportionate share. Their share of total personal income shrank again systematically in a sustained basis right through that whole post-war era, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. I think I'm starting to sound like an oldies goldies disc jockey on the radio. I'm talking about the greatest economic policies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Like it's a bit of nostalgia, but the reality was those were times when the economic pie was being redistributed in favor of workers and away from the rich elite. So look at, by the end of the 1970s, the richest 1%, their share of total income in Australia had declined to between 4 and 5%. So their share had been cut more than in half. So it's no wonder that the wealthy were objecting to this course of affairs. And, you know, I guess in their minds, it's horribly unacceptable that the richest 1% of society would only capture 5% of the total income. They only get 5 times their share. So this is, again, where business and financial elites and the wealthy and the think tanks that they fund and the political parties that they fund and the newspapers that they own all began a concerted effort to turn this ship around. And this happened elsewhere in the advanced industrial world as well. And now we've seen a systematic and sustained rebound in the richest 1% share of total income, getting back close to where it was before World War II. So both measured by the distribution of income across factors and the related distribution of income across individuals, most of the gains of the post-war era to create a more inclusive society, this is where the whole idea of a fair go for all in Australia came from, most of those gains have been erased. Now, the Fabian Society, of course, has done great work on the economic costs of inequality. This isn't just a matter for moral concern. It certainly is a matter for moral concern and fairness, but there's also real dollars and cents, bread and butter economic costs that economists are now recognizing in terms of data on the impact of inequality on health, on education outcomes, on criminality and policing costs, lots of expenses that we all bear through the fiscal side effects of inequality, and now a recognition of the sapping impact of inequality on macroeconomic performance. If workers can't get a raise, that means they can't go out and spend more, and that has been holding back the performance of Australia's economy. So the economic costs of this shift in income away from workers towards capital, I think, are becoming quite significant. It's clear from the correlation of the empirical evidence that the erosion of trade union influence in Australia's economy is one of the key factors behind that shift in income from workers to capital and the resulting polarization of income distribution across individuals. So we've seen a dramatic and sustained decline in trade union membership as a share of total employment in Australia's case. In the private sector now, it's below 10% of workers in Australia belong to unions, and the decline in unionization in Australia has been among the most severe of any of the industrial countries. Unions are under pressure everywhere, but in Australia's case, the decline in union membership has been catastrophic. Only New Zealand and Turkey are the only two other OECD countries where union membership has declined by as much as it has in Australia, and that undermines the ability of workers to address that fundamental asymmetry. And I think we're reaching a point of, in a way, of collapse in collective bargaining under the existing rules. And as I mentioned, Australia's rules are among the most restrictive of any industrial country. Here's a really shocking bit of data. This comes from the Commonwealth Government's Department of Employment, and it's now called Department of Small Business and Jobs and Small Business. They maintain a database that shows how many workers are covered by an enterprise bargaining agreement, an EBA. And we're experiencing a collapse in EBA coverage in the private sector. In the public sector, it's been more stable, but in the private sector, where employers are especially ruthless in trying to get rid of union influence and suppress wages, you've seen a decline by about 40% in the number of workers covered by enterprise agreements. And I think this does reflect the fact that unions have been so repressed and their activity so restricted, and the financial basis for union activity has been so undermined that some of the kind of previous inertia, if you like, which allowed enterprise bargaining coverage to be sustained even as union membership was declining, some of that inertia is now crumbling away. And the decline in enterprise bargaining coverage in the private sector, I think, is a real sign that the system is absolutely broken. And the impact, of course, has been this deceleration of wage growth in Australia that a lot of economists have been talking about over the last year. Typically, in Australia, you would be looking for wage increases per year of 3 to 4% or even higher. Now they're down below 2%, and this is, I'm showing here the data from the Wage Price Index published by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is one of the more optimistic indicators. There are other measures of wage growth which suggest wages are growing even slower than that. That means real wages for somebody who has a job are basically flat. There's no increase in real purchasing power, even as the economy is growing. And for workers in insecure jobs, who now make up actually over 50% of the total workforce, wage gains have been even worse. And as I mentioned, this further undermines the purchasing power and growth of the economy. There's no doubt that wage growth is closely correlated with union membership, union power, and union activity. For example, this is research that we published earlier this year that shows the correlation between the number of days lost in industrial disputes by decade and the wage growth during those decades. So again, you'll see in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and even in the 80s, when unions were still strong, workers had the ability to impose a cost of disagreement on their employers. They forced the employers to bargain, and they won higher wages as a result. Since then, in the 90s, the 2000s, and now especially in the 2010s, strikes and industrial disputes have basically disappeared. And as a result, wage increases are at their lowest pace in the entire post-war era. And again, this is not a coincidence. There are many factors at play behind the crisis in collective bargaining. Even if there had been no policy and institutional changes, union activity would have been pressured by the more intense competition and the globalization, the global pressures that we're experiencing under neoliberalism. But it's clear that policy has played an active role in undermining union activity as well. Enterprise bargaining agreements are basically kind of put on paper, and the ability of unions to enforce the terms of those agreements through a timely and effective arbitration procedure has been stripped under the current rules, and that undermines the value and integrity of those contracts. there's incredibly far-reaching limits on union activity from start to finish in terms of the ability of union organizers to access workplaces through the incredible number of hoops that you have to jump through to hold any kind of industrial action. As I mentioned, among the most restrictive in the industrial world, and including restrictions that are clearly in contradiction to ILO conventions and other norms of international labor rights. A key factor in Australia's case, very similar to the United States, is the full legal protection that's granted to free riders. Unions have no legal ability to ensure that all of the workers who are covered by an enterprise agreement and the wage gains and other benefits that are part of it make some kind of contribution to it. The idea of a worker just taking those benefits from the union and having complete legal protection to ignore any sort of responsibility to pay into the system that delivered those benefits is fully enforced in Australia. The only other jurisdiction that would be as similarly extreme in legal protection for free riders would be the United States in the wake of this latest Supreme Court decision in the United States. And of course, there's all kinds of other changes that have been implemented, including the prohibition on sector bargaining, pattern bargaining, and other provisions that have undermined union activity. So in this regard, I think the ACTU's campaign to change the rules that they've been working on for several months, and they're going to really turn up the heat on in the period leading up to the next election and beyond, I think is really identifying correctly one of the key causes of the rise in inequality in Australia. There's no doubt that the erosion of unions is a key factor behind the stagnation of wages and the growing inequality that it's visible, and the continuing decline in labor's share of GDP. It's interesting to hear people like Philip Lowe, governor of the Reserve Bank, stand up and in a way wring his hands over the fact that wage growth is so weak, because it makes his job more difficult. And he's said that normal wages should be growing by around 3.5% a year or more. But he ignores the institutional factors that explain this. It isn't a puzzle. It's clear that the stagnation of wages and the growth in inequality is an outcome of a deliberate set of measures aimed precisely at disempowering workers and reducing their power. So to solve that problem, we've got to go the other way. We have to have a multidimensional plan to strengthen union power, including the statutory protections for workers in the form of stronger minimum wages and penalty rates, relaxing the restrictions on union activity, making a union contract mean something by implementing a more effective and speedy arbitration and enforcement process, and allowing unions to play their rightful, essential, stable role in a normal functioning labor market. And that includes measures where unions are recognized as legitimate players, including in the process of determining changes to the awards, to the modern awards, and also giving unions the ability to collect the resources that they're going to need in order to fund that. If we argue that unions play a public good function, that is to say, the economy and the labor market can't function properly without strong unions, I think this is key to the case to making public support for unions much broader and more consistent than it is. And I think that the ACTU campaign is absolutely on the right track in that regard. So with that, I'll thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the next speaker and to your questions and comments after. Thank you very much.